For those of you who are not familiar with the younger sister of the Me Too movement, which is Time's Up, I'll just give you a little bit of background. Time's Up is a movement against sexual harassment. It was founded and announced in the New York Times on January 1st, 2018. There are handouts on the back table for those of you who just came in. It was founded by Hollywood celebrities in response to the Weinstein effect and the hashtag #MeToo. As of February 2018, Time's Up has raised $20 million for its legal defense fund and gathered over 200 volunteer lawyers. In addition, the movement is advocating for legislation that would punish companies that tolerate persistent harassment. It began a movement calling for gender parity in studio and talent agencies. It is calling for women on the red carpet at the 75th Golden Globe Awards to wear black and speak out about sexual harassment and assault. And I thought the name hashtag Time's Up was a delightful double entendre to use in the title for this class, which is an exploration of a dark and troublesome biblical story which has long agitated its readers, and perhaps especially female readers, because in addition to the sexual violence of a young woman, the story as framed by traditional commentaries included an indictment of the victim's behavior and seemed to blame her for the crime. And now, hashtag Time's Up. It's time for this story to be read properly. But before we do that, let's first do a quick read-through of the story in its entirety. So you should have your handout. And the story is from Genesis, or in Hebrew, Bereshit. Perek is Hebrew for chapter 34. We're on page 2. Dina, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to look out among the daughters of the land. Now, you're going to see that interspersed with the biblical verses, you have Rashi's commentary, the medieval Rashi, the foremost commentator on Bible and Talmud. We're going to skip that for now, so please look for the next instance of a verse, which is denoted by the number 2. So Dina goes out to look among the daughters of the land, and in verse 2, the Bible tells us that Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her, he lay with her, and he violated her. Okay, read Rashi with me quickly. Lay with her in a natural way. He raped her, violated her, afflicted her in an unnatural way, of course, a euphemism for sodomy, and some other unmentionable activities. Verse 3, and his soul cleaved to Dina, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl, and he spoke to the girl's heart. Rashi said, seductive words. Verse 4, and Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, take this girl for me as a wife. Jacob had heard that he had defiled his daughter Dina, but his sons were with his livestock in the field, and Jacob kept silent until they came home. So presumably, Jacob is waiting for reinforcement in the form of his young, strong sons so that they can confer and decide how to deal with this terrible violation of Dina. In the meantime, Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. There's an urgency here that is catapulted by his sons lusting for the girl Dina. And Jacob's sons had come from the field when they heard, and the men were grieved, and they burned fiercely because he had committed a scandalous act in Israel to lie with the daughter of Jacob, and such ought not to be done. And it's important for you to look at Rashi's comment here, and such ought not to be done, to violate virgins, for the nations, the general population, had refrained from illicit relationships because of the flood. Okay, so before the great flood in the times of Noah, before the great deluge, we're told that immorality, well, I want to say ran rampant, but it was much more than that. There was a loss of understanding that anything could be immoral effectively. And so there was a swinging of the pendulum. And this was the first time that something so terrible had happened. And this is important for you to keep in mind as we look at how Jacob's sons, and namely 2 of Jacob's sons, reacted to this. Verse 8, and Hamor spoke with them, saying, my son Shechem and his soul has a liking for your daughter. please give her to him for a wife. Okay? So here you have this powerful warlord using words like please give him, making himself vulnerable, begging, imploring. And he says, and you know what? This is going to be such a fruitful consolidation of our interests. Look at verse 9. And intermarry with us. You shall give us your daughters, and you shall take our daughters for yourselves, and you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Remain, do business there, and settle there. It's going to be phenomenal. We're going to consolidate our assets. Verse 11, and Shem said to her father and to her brothers, may I find favor in your eyes. Whatever you tell me, I will give. So here is Shechem, a young, arrogant, virile animal in the guise of a human being who humbles himself and acts completely out of form with who he is. And he says, I need to find favor in your eyes. Whatever you tell me, I will give. Verse 12, impose upon me a large marriage settlement and gifts, and I'll give as much as you ask of me, but give me the girl for a wife. Again, there's an increased urgency here. Thereupon, Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with cunning. And they spoke because, after all, he had defiled their sister Dina. Verse 14 on page 6. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to a man who has a foreskin, for that is a disgrace to us. Okay, we hear you. We understand. You want to marry our sister, but we really can't do that because you're uncircumcised, and that goes against our ethos. It goes against who we are. But with this, however, we will consent to you. If you will be like us, that every male will be circumcised. That is you and everybody in your extended posse. Then in verse 16, we will give you our daughters, and we will take your daughters for ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. Verse 17 on page 8, but if you do not listen to us to be circumcised, we will take our daughter and go. Okay, so basically this is a deal breaker. Either you circumcise yourself and all of your people, and remember, you're talking about a superpower, or we're taking our girl and we're walking out of these negotiations. And surprisingly, in verse 18, their words pleased Hamor and Shem, the sons of Hamor. Okay, we can do this. And the young man did not delay to do the thing because he desired Jacob's daughter, and he was the most honored in all of his father's household, which meant that if he could do this, everybody else would fall in line. Verse 20, and Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city, and they spoke to the people of the city, saying, these men are peaceful with us, and they will dwell on the land and do business there. And the land, behold, it is spacious enough for them. We will take their daughters for ourselves as wives, and we will give them our daughters. 22. However, there is one small caveat. Only with this condition will the men consent to dwell with us to become one people, by every male among us being circumcised, just as they are circumcised. But what is that when you think about the larger picture and you zoom out in verse 23? Then shall not their cattle, their property, and all their beasts be ours, but let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us. And verse 24, and all those coming out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male, all who went out of the gate of a city became circumcised. Verse 25, now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that Jacob's two sons, Shimon and Levi, Dina's brothers, each took his sword, and they came upon the city with confidence, and they slew every male. Verse 26, and Hamor and his son Shechem they slew at the edge of the sword, and they took Dina out of Shechem's house, and they left. Jacob's sons came upon the slain and plundered the city that had defiled their sister. And all their verse 28, their flocks and their cattle and their donkeys and whatever was in the city and whatever was in the field they took. And all their wealth and all their infants and their wives they captured and plundered, and all that was in the house they captured. And thereupon Jacob said to Shimon and Levi, you have troubled me to discredit me among the inhabitants of the land. You have created a terrible situation for me. Among the Canaanites and among the Perizzites, I am few in number. They will gather against me, and I and my household will be destroyed. What did you do? Were you thinking? But, interestingly enough, the last word belongs to the brothers. And they simply put forth to their father a rhetorical question. And they said, shall he make our sister like a harlot? And there is no response to that question. So now that we've done a basic read-through, let's go back and really look at this story under a microscope. At least one part of the story. We don't have time to do more than that. They're very short time allotments here, I have to tell you. I suffer from times up, from the moment I get into a session until the end. But before I do that, I just want to do some kind of housekeeping and get an issue that I'm thinking is in your mind out of the way. And that is the violent behavior of Shimon and Levi. True, Shechem acted in vile and heinous manner, but what's with their reaction? And in fact, as you might imagine, the biblical commentators treat this thoroughly. And I'm just going to here, because we have to do this quickly, quote Maimonides on this. And Maimonides says, and that's why I wanted to point out that first Rashi about how this had not been done to violate a virgin from the time of the flood. Maimonides says that actually their legal status was one of what he calls a ir hanidachat, a city that has forsaken any and all mores and ethos. And therefore, they actually deserved to be completely destroyed. That was the halachic designation of the city because they had not risen up against Shechem and stopped him. One of the 7 Noahide laws is to establish courts of justice. Hamor, Shechem, they shouldn't have been able to get away with this. They should have been dragged before a court. But they weren't, which meant the entire city, the entire region, were complicit with this act and therefore, legally speaking, deserve this. Now, it's a very complex story. This is one voice. This is the legal voice. And we know that at the end of his life, before Jacob passed away, he actually berated Shimon and Levi for this act. And the commentaries tell us he berated not their action as much as the unbridled anger that catapulted them into this action. But we could spend 45 minutes just talking about that. What I really want to talk about is Dina. And I want to go back to the beginning of the story and just read it with you once more very, very quickly. Dina, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to look out among the daughters of the land. And Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, and he took her, and he lay with her, and he violated with her. And his soul cleaved to Dina, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke to the girl's heart. And Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Take this girl for me as a wife." I want you to notice the completely anomalous chain of events as they unfurl between attacker and victim. Rape, molestation, harassment, violation, these have nothing to do with sexual attraction. They are about power, which is why typically the perpetrator of the attack leaves the victim behind like a piece of garbage, like a used piece of toilet paper, never looks back after he gets what he wants. The storyline alerts us to a whole different dimension at play here, and we will have occasion to come back and examine this more quickly. Now, please take a look at your sources, and I want you to look at one source on page 18. It's the first source on page 18. It's next to the last source in the book. It's a Midrash from Bereshadraba 8:12. And it reads as follows. Any woman which goes out to the market ultimately will stumble. How do we know this? From Dina. As it is written, and Dina went out, and ultimately she stumbled, as it is written, and Shechem saw her. Okay? So this Midrash clearly tells us that Dina's going out was the source of the trouble. Further, this story serves as proof positive that when a woman goes out, one can expect that it will lead to downfall. Implication: women venturing outside of their tents, their homes, the private sector is just a prelude. It's just asking. It's just an invitation to disaster. Now, please go back to the first verse in the story and look with me at the Rashi on the words Vatetze Dina bat Leah, specifically on the words bat Leah, the daughter of Leah. Rashi asks, the daughter of Leah, and not the daughter of Jacob? Why is she called the daughter of Leah? However, because of her going out, she was called the daughter of Leah, since Leah too was in the habit of going out, as it is written, and Leah came forth towards him. And that is in Genesis 30:16. And concerning Dina, the rabbis devised the proverb. We have the well-known adage, like mother, like daughter. Okay? Now, for years, we're talking thousands of years, not hundreds, not tens. This Rashi was understood to be in line with the various midrashic explanations. I just gave you Exhibit A, but there are many, which all seemed to imply a condemnation of Dina venturing forth. That is until #Time's Up in December of 1986, when the Rebbe unveiled a radically new way of understanding this Rashi. It should be noted as background that the Rebbe developed and taught an ingenious methodology for truly understanding Rashi's commentary, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. In 1964, after his mother passed during the holiday season, the Rebbe began to deliver a discourse during his Shabbos Farbrengens, his Shabbos gatherings, that offered a piercing analysis of one Rashi from that week's Torah portion. And so he did the same for the Rashi we are about to examine. And as I said, this happened in 1986. For thousands of years, everybody understood this Rashi one way. And one Shabbos, the Rebbe changed it all. And we are going to follow his methodology. We're going to follow his process. So let's look at this Rashi again. The daughter of Leah, and not the daughter, back on page 2 still. I'll tell you when I'm moving. And not the daughter of Jacob. However, because of her going out, she was called the daughter of Leah, since Leah too was in the habit of going out. How do we know this? Because we read this earlier in Genesis 30, Leah came forth towards him. And concerning her, they devised a proverb, like mother, like daughter. And the Rebbe looks at this, and he concedes, of course, that there is a question in this verse, which is the inclusion of the seemingly redundant phrase, bat Leah, the daughter of Leah, asher yolda Yaakov, that she bore to Jacob. We know that the Bible is very parsimonious with words. So any extra word, any seeming redundancy has to alert us to some lesson. But the Rebbe says, don't be so quick to jump to conclusions. There is a question here. There's something to be studied. But the Rebbe opines that Rashi has already explained why, in anomalous fashion, Dina is called Bat Leah. Conventionally, genealogy in the Bible is almost always according to the patrilineal lineage. But earlier, Rashi has already told us, and I couldn't have the whole Genesis copied for you, so I didn't give you this source, but I'm going to read this to you. So earlier in Genesis, the Torah tells us, and afterwards she, meaning Leah, bore a daughter, and she named her Dina. Rashi says, our sages explained that Leah pronounced judgment upon herself. Now, the word Dina, the name Dina, etymologically is rooted in the two letters Dan, Dalet and Nun, which means to judge. So she judged herself. She named her daughter Dina. What type of judgment did she pass upon herself? She reasoned, if the child I bear, she had this thought process while she was pregnant, is male, my sister will not be even as esteemed as one of the handmaidens, because she did a quick calculation and she realized she already had the largest measure of the 12 tribes. And the other 2 handmaids had 2 each. So the 6, 2, and 2, you have 10. If she has another son, that's it. Rachel can at most have one of the 12 tribes. So she prayed over her fetus in utero, and he was turned into a female. And this is a fascinating thing in itself, which I can speak about for 86 minutes easily, and the implications for surrogacy, and so on and so forth. But suffice it to say that, yes, Dina and Joseph, and we'll come back to this connection soon, were switched in utero. Okay? So now, Rashi says, I already told you why she's called Dina bat Leah. If, however, the Torah tells us Dina bat Leah again, there must be an additional message. But, says the Rebbe, why do you think it's negative? What tells you it's negative? In fact, you know, when you read the Rebbe's Sikha, the Rebbe's original exposition on this, you wonder, how did not every other rabbinic mind see this in glaring fashion as the Rebbe makes it clear to us? So the Rebbe says, look, Rashi tells us exactly why he is drawing this parallel. He tells us to look at chapter 30, verse 16. You should take Rashi seriously and look at where Leah went forth. So you do have that, and that is on page 13 for you. And this is Rashi's reference to Leah going out, her being an outgoing woman, as it were. So does everybody have it on page 13? Okay. So just to give you some background, just to remind you, so in an already intricate and let's just say interesting story concerning a love triangle between Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, we have yet another interesting story, like Matryoshka dolls, one in another and another. And this is the story of Reuven, the eldest son of Leah, going out into the field and gathering dudaim, which might be mandrakes or might be some other type of flower. That's a whole other discussion. But in any case, he brings them to his mother because he understands her suffering. He understands how she's the second fiddle here. Rachel is the beloved wife. And so this is a tender act of affection and sensitivity, and he gives her the flowers. Her sister Rachel comes into the room and says, wow, dudaim, those flowers are gorgeous. I want them. To which Leah says, is it not enough that you have stolen my husband, but you also want my flowers? Rachel says to herself, touchy. Whew. Now, everybody in this room knows that when you have a reaction that is out of proportion to the situation, something else is going on. Of course something else is going on. So Rachel says, you know what? Since you are so besotted with our shared husband, you know what? You have this night with him. I'll take the flowers. If this is reminiscent of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob, literally for a small hill of beans, you're correct. But that's a whole other class. But we'll move forward here. This is the context, okay? So now Leah has bought this night with Jacob. There was a rotation. This was not supposed to be her night. It was supposed to be Rachel's night. So Leah, when Jacob came from the field, verse 16, please look with me, in the evening, and Leah came forth towards him. This is where she goes out, Vatetse Leah, the same biblical words as Vatetse Dina. She goes out to intercept him. And she says, young man, you shall come to me, because I have hired you with my sons Dudaim. And he slept with her that night. Now, for those of you who don't read Hebrew, I apologize. I hope I will make it clear without you being able to see it. For those of you who do, it's worthwhile looking at the last Hebrew word in verse 16 in this chapter 30. And that word is who. And that word is completely redundant here, because it could have easily said, Vayishkav ima balayla, and he slept with her at night. And we would know that it was that night, because it was that night that was being negotiated. Right? It's not New Year's Eve. So why the word who? Rashi says, balayla hu. Please look at the last lines on page 13. The Holy One, who is not talking, it's not qualifying which night. It's who, which in Hebrew is he, with a capital H. God, blessed be he, assisted that Yisachar should be born from that union. Is there any whiff of wrongdoing on the part of Leah here? On the contrary, it seems that she is, in categoric fashion, being rewarded for what she did by getting the one thing she wants more than anything, another son. And God does that. And verse 17, which follows on page 14 in your booklet, solidifies that by saying, and God hearkened to Leah, and she conceived, and she bore Jacob a fifth son. So, says the Rebbe, I don't understand why anybody ever thought this Rashi was saying anything negative about Dina. It says Dina went out, and why is the Bible saying that she's the daughter of Leah? Because she went out just like her mother Leah went out. Why did her mother Leah go out? She went to tell her husband that he was going to be with her that night. What happened as a result of that? Yisachar was born, the tribe from which the most concentrated form of Torah scholarship came to be. So she didn't do anything wrong. So how did you turn this on its head and say that Dina going out is something wrong? Can't be. The Rebbe says more than that. Why are you thinking that the Torah is coming to say something negative about Dina? The Rebbe cites the rule that the Torah doesn't even talk negatively about animals. In the story of the great flood and the animals that Noah took on the ark, it says the holy animal, the pure animals, and those that were not pure. It doesn't say the impure animals. It says those that were not pure, because the Torah doesn't even want to say something negative about an animal. Why would the Torah say something negative and disparaging about Dina? Can't be. So, now the Rebbe says that, and here I'm going to cite one of the great axioms of the Rebbe's methodology on learning Rashi properly, and that is that Rashi's commentary is cumulative. It builds like scaffolding on itself. That is to say, that Rashi expects his students to remember all that he taught in previous instances. If so, says the Rebbe, to understand more about the story, we must look at a previous Rashi concerning Dina. So I refer you now to page 14, and this is chapter 32, verse 22. And I'll give you the context for this story as well. This is one of those moments in the Bible where we collectively hold our breath. After many years of Jacob hiding from the wrath of his brother Esau, he decides, #time's up. Enough is enough. He is venturing forth. He has hunkered down enough. He is going out in the wider world. And as he feared, he gets word that Esau is coming towards him with an army. And Jacob prays to God, and he sets up a military offensive plan, and he sends diplomatic overtures to his brother Esau. So he really, tries everything. And in that hair-raising moment, just before Esau comes upon Jacob, we read this verse. Jacob, the he in this verse is Jacob, arose during that night. He took his 2 wives and his maidservants and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Yabok. He crossed the Yabok River to put distance between him and his brother. Look at Rashi, please. Rashi says, the attentive reader of the Bible knows that at this point Jacob has 12 children, not 11. He has 11 sons and he has a daughter. How could the Torah say 11 children? Where was Dina? Benjamin was not yet born, but Dina should have been counted. But he put her in a chest and locked her in so that Esau should not set eyes on her. Therefore, Jacob was punished for withholding her from his brother, because had Esau married Dina, perhaps she would cause him to improve his ways, and therefore she fell into the hands of Shem. Okay, follow the logic with me here. Okay, Dina falls into the hands of Shem because her father Jacob did a sin by withholding her from his brother Esau. Alarm bells, anybody? What happened to the sins of the father not being visited upon the children? And why this kind of punishment? And by the way, what kind of father would have exposed his daughter to the likes of Esau? The whole thing is almost impossible to understand. But the Rebbe understands this Rashi is containing the linchpin information for unlocking the mystery of our present Rashi. Dina, the Rebbe teaches, clearly had spectacular powers to transform. So much so that even on the chance that she could alter Esav, although it was doubtful, Yaakov was expected to try to give her the opportunity. In fact, the Rebbe points out that from the fact that Jacob was punished for this, it indicates that there was no doubt that Dina could have transformed Esav. It's a sure thing. Why does Rashi use the word perhaps? Because Esau, like every other human being, has freedom of choice. But from the perspective of Dina's abilities, there was no doubt that she could completely transform the wicked Esau by inspiring him to return to the path of God. Which means, teaches the Rebbe, that when Dina went out, she went out for explicitly, uniquely, and solely this reason. Because transformation, her transformative powers, is what made her tick. She went out to see how she could impact the young women of that region. There was nary a lewd thought of or immodest intention in her going out. She had an agenda, a mission. And this essential and salient aspect of her personality, teaches the Rebbe, came to her by virtue of the fact that she was Bat Leah, the daughter of Leah. And for this, the Rebbe sends us now to Rashi in chapter 29, verse 17, and you have it on page 15. So this is the kind of verse that makes you do a double take. I mean, this is the Bible after all. This is Jacob, right? The most perfect of all of the patriarchs. We're taught that he spent 8 decades getting ready to marry. And I just find humor in the fact that it's verse 17. It's not 17 magazine. And yet, all the Bible has to say about these 2 great women is Leah's eyes were tender and Rachel had beautiful features and a beautiful complexion. Really? So that's a whole other class. But for now, look at Rashi. Leah's eyes were tender. Tender because she expected to fall into Esau's lot. And she wept because everyone was saying, Rebekah has 2 sons, and Laban has 2 daughters, the older daughter for the older son, and the younger daughter for the younger son. Now, understand me here. This wasn't just the women gossiping in the market that, oh, this is so symmetrical and it's going to be so cute. The older daughter is going to marry the older son, and the younger son is going to marry the younger daughter. Okay? There was a cosmic implication here. Because, in fact, Leah could have transformed Esau, but the time was not ripe. And this power did not come to full blossom in Leah. But, as the poet says, what is contained must be released. And so it might have happened in the next generation through Dina if the time had been right. But still, it was not the appropriate time for the force of Esau to be neutralized. But Dina's power, Dina's energy was too great to be squandered. And so she went out. This can help explain why Shem is so inexorably drawn to Dina. He's attracted to her magnetically because Dina was destined to transform the people of that region. He felt that pull. He was drawn by the power of her energy into her orb. And the Rebbe points out that indeed, what happened as a result of the story, the men of that region were all circumcised before they were killed, and the women and children joined Yaakov's household. They became integrated in Jacob's household. They took on his godly mores and his ethos. Now you might say, bah, you're grasping at straws. They were tricked into circumcision. This was solely an economic equation for them. This was not a moral, religious, spiritual choice they made. Still in all, the commentators point out that they could not have been oblivious to the fact that in those days, only the seed of Abraham were circumcised. And so circumcision, irrespective of what pragmatic reason had clinched that decision, circumcision served as a conversion of sorts, a crossing over, as we might say. Now here I wish to digress from the Rebbe's treatment to point out a fascinating parallel to this, which is found much later in the book of Genesis. But first, come with me to verse 45 in chapter 41. And that is on page, well, the beginning is on page 15, but go to 16. So, very quickly, Joseph rises through the ranks of Egyptian culture and society after he so successfully and in such compelling fashion is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and so much so that he becomes the viceroy. And in verse 45, we learn that Pharaoh named Joseph Tzafnat Paneach, and he gave him Asnat, the daughter of Potiphera, who was the governor of On, for a wife, and Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Now, come with me to page 18, please. All you have to do is turn the page. And this is a second Midrash here. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer teaches, bottom of page 18. Because the daughter of Jacob was abiding in the tents, and she did not go into the street, what did Shechem, the son of Hamor, do? He brought dancing girls who were also playing on pipes in the street. Dina went forth to see those girls who were making merry, and he seized her, and he slept with her, and she conceived, and she bore Asnat. The sons of Israel said she should be killed, for they said now people would say in all the land that there was an immoral daughter in the tents of Jacob. But Jacob, of course, did not listen to them. What did he do? He wrote the holy name upon a golden plate, and he suspended it about her neck and sent her away. She went away. Everything is revealed before the Holy One, blessed be he. And Michael the angel descended and took her, and he brought her down to Egypt to the house of Potiphera, because Asnat was destined to become the wife of Joseph. And now the wife of Potiphera was barren, and Asnat grew up with her as a daughter. How did Joseph meet Asnat, his niece with whom he got married, the daughter of Dina? Again, the colliding of the orbits of Dina and Joseph. This happens a number of times in the Bible. Well, we're told that when Joseph was being paraded through the streets of Egypt as a newly minted viceroy, in what I always think of as the first ticker tape parade, all of the young women in Egypt lined the rooftops, and they threw things at Joseph. And Osnat threw the locket that her grandfather had put around her neck, within which was recorded her lineage. When he opened the locket and he saw who this was, it was just a matter of finding who the slipper, the crystal slipper, whose foot it fit on. And he married her. That's entertaining maybe, but that's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you this for verse 55. Verse 55, when the entire land of Egypt hungered, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. That's on page 16. But Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he tells you, do. Now, this is a very strange way of telling them what to do when they're hungry. It should have said, go to Joseph and ask him for bread, buy bread from him, barter for bread, beg, plead, implore. What does it mean, do everything he tells you to do? It's strange. And Rashi, of course, illuminates this. He says, since Joseph had ordered them to circumcise themselves, and when they came to Pharaoh, they said, this man's out of his mind. All we want is bread. He's forcing us to circumcise ourselves? So Pharaoh said to them, well, why didn't you gather grain? Didn't he announce to you that the years of famine were coming? And they replied, yeah, in fact, we gathered much, but it rotted. So Pharaoh replied to them, if so, you better do whatever he tells you. He issued a decree upon the grain, and it rotted. What if he issues a decree upon us, and you rot? But what's fascinating is that the daughter of Dina, who is the daughter of Leah, Osnat, now becomes Joseph's partner in the transformation of Egyptian culture. It's pretty interesting parallel. So again, it's curious. What is this with circumcision under duress? Apparently, that was a profound way of spiritually changing the inner landscape of these people. This is Leah's power. This is Dina's power. This is Osnat's power. Now, the Rebbe concluded this radical paradigm shift, not content with simply imparting brilliant and even mind-altering insights, but with a clarion call for action. The Rebbe said, although the psalmist teaches, and this is one of those verses in the Psalms that's very often cited, you can see it on page 19. It's in the 45th Psalm, it's verse 14. The royal princess, her beauty is within, her dress embroidered with golden mountings. The Rebbe said, yes, the psalmist does teach that the glory of a Jewish woman is within, and that her main privilege and responsibility is to be the anchor and the mainstay of her home, the Akeret HaBayit. Still, the Rebbe says, all women who were gifted with the ability to transform the world without must do so, albeit in modest fashion, and inspire and impact those with whom they come in contact. The Rebbe here displays one of the many, many paradoxes that marked his great leadership. He was both a revolutionary and a traditionalist in his outlook, and he braided those two strands expertly. He underscores twice in this address the necessity for a woman going out to be done in modest fashion. He does not for one moment disavow a woman's indelible and unparalleled mark on, and thus her great responsibility to her home and family. And yet at the same time, he completely eschews the idea that a woman's place is only and exclusively in her home. In fact, he goes as far as teaching that not using her God-given talents and resources is a gross violation of her responsibilities, which include both her personal home and God's home, the world entire. In fact, the Rebbe ups the ante and says, the feminine approach, which is generally less combative than the male, yields much greater success in this sphere. The glory of the king's daughters within is not to be construed as indoors, in her home, in her kitchen, behind the curtain, chained to a vat of chicken soup, pregnant, barefooted, without a scintilla of brain matter. But rather that her glory is that she operates wherever she is, in the courtroom, in the boardroom, in the ER, and in the OR, in an inward, more feminine modality, even without in the wider world as well. The world, the Rebbe taught, depends on a woman utilizing her talents and resources properly. And when that happens, we will have much less confusion and chaos. Time's up on all of that. Enough is enough. It is time for respect, dignity, and yes, a woman's full-fledged glory. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns? There is a darkness to the story which I'm not going to try to massage away. One approach, which we find over and over, and it's not exclusive to this story, we find this in the need for the blessings to be wrangled from Isaac in a less than savory fashion, right? Jacob and his mother, Rebecca, they conspire. There are many, many other instances. And my time is up. So to put this very, very succinctly, there is this Kabbalistic notion that, I know my time is up, that the most precious, the most exalted, the most vaunted energies can only come into this world in a very, very difficult, circuitous, and even violent manner, and often with deceit. It's kind of like saying, if I wanted to smuggle the Hope diamond out of the Smithsonian, I'm not going to declare it at customs. It has to be smuggled into this world, as it were. And what Dina had to accomplish was tremendous in its sublime value. I'm not trying to take away that she suffered and it was difficult, but what I am trying to clarify is that there is no hint, when you understand the story this way, in Dina doing anything wrong. Now, why people have to suffer is a whole different question. And I have a lot of questions for God. But I don't think she should worry about naming her daughter Dina. But there you go. Naming a child, it contains an aspect of prophecy. So this couple will ultimately come prophetically to the name they should give their child.
If you like that video, hit the subscribe button and notification bell below for hours of the best Jewish content online.